François Gérard was born in Rome, where his father held an important post in the household of the French ambassador. The family moved to Paris in 1782, and the young Gérard joined the Pension du Roi, where he began his art studies. In 1786, Gérard joined the studio of Jacques-Louis David, along with Girodet, Fabre, and Antoine Gros, who painted this charming portrait of the young Gérard. The skills Gérard acquired working in David's studio stood him in good stead for the rest of his career. And in this painting of Brutus and his sons, Gérard was probably responsible for the figure of the nurse on the extreme right of the painting. Gérard did not share David's extreme republican sentiments, but nonetheless, the exigencies of the times required him to prepare a sketch for an important competition painting, the 10th of August 1792, the storming of the Tuileries. With the end of the Terror, Gérard could pursue his own path, beginning with a portrait of his friend Isabey with his young daughter, and then his great historical work, Belisarius, a really innovative and unusual painting at that time. The large version of this painting, exhibited at the 1796 Salon, was admired by the critics but also criticised, and the artist resolved to paint a second, smaller version, also engraved, which is different from the first because of the helmet hanging from the general's belt. The success of Belisarius exacerbated a breach with his friend Girodet, particularly over the way that Gérard had painted the head of Belisarius' young guide, and seems to parallel it with the pose of the sleeping Endymion. The superbly preserved small version was acquired by the Getty Museum from the Stair Sainty gallery. Gérard is better remembered today as a portraitist, as of this painting of the exquisite Madame Recamier, and of course Napoleon, here in one of the many versions with studio assistants wearing his coronation robes, and of Napoleon's family, Caroline Bonaparte, married to his famous Marshal Joachim Murat, King of Naples, here with her children, and his brother-in-law Prince Camillo Borghese in a painting recently acquired by the Frick collection. Borghese was married to Pauline Bonaparte. Nonetheless, he was still able to paint some major historical subjects, such as his painting of the Battle of Austerlitz, which took place on the anniversary of Napoleon's coronation and marked his victory over the Central European powers. One of the artist's major patrons was Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord, the French aristocrat who had become revolutionary, fled to America to become a real estate agent, returned to play a major role in establishing Napoleon's rule. Later disillusioned, he was responsible for bringing back the Bourbons in the person of Louis XVIII. Here portrayed in his coronation robes, although he never actually went through the coronation ceremony. Gérard was a beneficiary of the first commission from Louis XVIII, a representation of Henry IV entering Paris at the end of the Wars of Religion. And this was intended to parallel the end of the Wars of Napoleon, and show how the king, Louis XVIII, was as magnanimous as his ancestor. The sketch, which was brought to the king for his approval, was given to his niece, the Duchess of Berry. The most notable change Louis required of the artist was to remove Henry's helmet so that he would look less military in the finished work. The large version now hangs in the Salle de Bataille in Versailles, and on the right of this image one can see Gérard's painting of the Battle of Austerlitz. While still working primarily as a portraitist, Gérard painted the occasional history subject, such as Corinne at Miseno, a subject taken from a novel by Madame de Staël. One of the most exceptional of his later portraits is that of Valentine de Barbe de Bertrand de Crillon, from an ancient French noble family, and is unusual in not simply presenting her against an anonymous background, but has her turning the pages of a large book of illustrations, probably Redutti's Choix des plus belles fleurs, which rests on an elegant Boulle Revival bureau-plat. Gérard, of course, continued to be patronised by the royal family. Here a portrait of the Duchess of Berry, the daughter-in-law of the future Charles X, with her son and daughter, the son to be the great hope of the Bourbon dynasty. These hopes were to be crushed by Louis-Philippe, Duke of Orleans, the king's cousin, who was to depose Charles X, taking the throne as Louis-Philippe, Roi des Français, King of the French. With the death of Louis XVIII, who was childless, his brother Charles succeeded as Charles X. The new king determined to restore, in every sense, the traditions of the monarchy, and hold a coronation ceremony in Reims Cathedral, which had been the site of royal coronations since the early 11th century. Gérard was commissioned to paint a portrait of the king in his robes, and in several versions, and also a painting of the coronation ceremony itself, which, as one can see, is modelled quite distinctly on the coronation portrait by David of Emperor Napoleon. This largely studio version hangs in the museum in Chartres. The finished painting at Versailles is not presently on show. Gérard's portrait of the king himself was begun some months before the ceremony, so it could be completed and exhibited in the Louvre at the very moment the king was crowned. The king is wearing ermine and velvet robes sewn with gold fleur-de-lis. The collar of the Grand Mastership of the Saint-Esprit is placed around his neck. His right hand rests on the sceptre, while the hand of justice and crown are placed on a velvet embroidered cushion. The various studio versions replicated the pose of the king, the stool, crown, and other regalia in an identical fashion to the original first version, which the king had given to Talleyrand. Talleyrand, whose wife was also painted by Gérard in this portrait now hanging in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, also owned the coronation painting of Napoleon, the first version, now lost, the portrait of Louis XVIII by Gérard, and this portrait of Charles X, the first and autographed version of this last great French royal portrait.